It was a warm afternoon, the kind of day where the sun sits high in the sky, casting long golden shadows across the streets. The neighborhood was calm. Children played in the distance, and cars rolled by slowly. An elderly woman, dressed neatly, in a long coat and holding a small grocery bag, walked carefully down the sidewalk. She moved at her own pace, unhurried, enjoying the rhythm of her steps. To anyone watching, she looked like what she truly was, someone's grandmother returning home after running a few errands, but peace can change in an instant. As she turned the corner, a police car slowed down beside her. The car's presence felt heavy, its tires crunching against the road. Inside, two uniformed officers exchanged quick glances before one rolled down the window. They didn't greet her with warmth. Instead, their eyes carried suspicion, as though her very existence on that street demanded an explanation. The woman stopped walking when she noticed the car staying close. She felt that familiar weight in her chest, a feeling she had experienced before: unwanted attention, the kind that comes not from admiration, but from doubt and mistrust. She clutched her bag a little tighter, wondering why the officers were staring. She was elderly, her hair streaked with gray, her posture slightly bent with age. Yet to these officers, she was not seen as harmless. She was seen as a problem, excuse. "Me, ma'am," one officer finally called out, his voice sharp, not polite. "Where are you going?" The woman looked at him calmly. She had lived long enough to know when someone's tone carried hidden meaning. The officer wasn't asking out of concern. He was asking as if she didn't belong there, as if walking with groceries on her own street was suspicious. "I'm going home," she replied softly, her voice steady but kind. She pointed toward the row of small houses just a few blocks away. Officer didn't seem satisfied. "Do you live around here?" He pressed, narrowing his eyes. "Yes, I've lived here for many years," she answered, not raising her voice. But inside, she felt the frustration rising. Why should she prove where she belonged? She had walked this same street countless times. She had raised her children in that neighborhood, watched them grow, and now even watched her grandchildren visit. Still, the questions continued. The second officer got out of the car, his boots hitting the pavement with a heavy sound. He stood tall, arms crossed, looking down at her as though she were a suspect in some unseen crime. "Can we see some identification?" he demanded. The woman sighed. At her age, she had learned to carry her ID, not because she expected trouble, but because she knew the world often demanded proof of who she was. Slowly, she reached into her purse and handed over her card. The officer glanced at it, then at her, then back again, as if searching for something to use against her. The neighborhood grew quieter. A few people stopped what they were doing and began to watch. An old man watering his lawn frowned and shook his head. A mother pulling her child's hand whispered softly, pointing at the scene. They had seen such encounters before. It was always the same story. Someone singled out, someone made to feel small. The woman stood tall despite her age. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the sting of humiliation. She knew she had done nothing wrong. She knew she deserved the same respect as anyone else. But at that moment, under the weight of the officer's stares, she was reminded how quickly dignity could be stripped away in the eyes of those who carried badges. Minutes passed like hours. The officers asked questions that had nothing to do with her walking home. Where had she been before the store? Did she live alone? Was she sure this was her neighborhood? Their words weren't about finding truth. They were about showing power. Yet she refused to shrink. She answered each question with calmness, refusing to give them the satisfaction of anger. Inside her, a quiet strength burned. She was no stranger to struggle. She had lived through decades of hardship, of moments where her voice had been ignored or dismissed. But she had also lived long enough to know that patience and dignity were her greatest weapons. The air grew tense. the moment heavy to anyone. Passing by, it might have seemed like a small incident, a stop on the street, a few questions asked. But to her, it was more than that. It was yet another reminder of the battles people like her had to fight every day, even in the simplest of moments. A walk home from the store should have been ordinary. Instead, it became a stage where injustice tried to play itself out once again. She looked at the officers, her eyes calm but firm. They thought they were in control, but they had no idea who they were really dealing with. Little did they know, this elderly woman was far from powerless. Behind her quiet smile and steady answers, there was someone with connections far beyond what they could imagine. A truth that would soon turn this encounter upside down. And as the police continued to hassle her, she made a decision in her heart. Enough was enough. She would not let them strip her of her dignity. She would remind them that respect was not theirs to give or take, it was hers by right. Asterisk. The moment stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable. The elderly woman stood still on the sidewalk, her grocery bag resting against her leg, while the two police officers circled around her like predators who had found their prey. What began as a simple question, "Where are you going?" had now turned into something more hostile, something designed not to seek truth, but to intimidate. First officer tilted his head and smirked, as if he had caught her in a lie. "You said you live around here," he repeated, dragging out the words. "Funny because I don't remember ever seeing you before." The woman's heart beat a little faster, though her face remained calm. She knew this trick well, the tactic of sowing doubt, of making her question her own belonging. But she would not fall into that trap. "I've lived here longer than you've been patrolling these streets," she said softly, her voice steady, her eyes locked on his. The second officer chuckled under his breath. "Oh, really? Then maybe you can tell us which house is yours. Point it out. Let's see if your story checks out." His tone dripped with sarcasm, the kind of tone meant to embarrass rather than to seek any truth. The woman exhaled slowly, fighting back the sting of insult. She raised her hand and pointed toward a small brick house with blue shutters at the end of the block. "That one," she said plainly. The first officer narrowed his eyes, as though even her honesty was suspicious. "Convenient answer," he muttered. "You could have just picked any house." A small crowd had started to gather now. Neighbors, curious about the commotion, lingered nearby. Some pulled out their phones, recording discreetly. Others shook their heads, muttering words like unnecessary and shameful. The woman could feel their eyes on her. But what hurt more was the lack of humanity in the eyes of the officers standing just inches away. They weren't here to protect her. They weren't here to serve the community. They were here to remind her of something she had felt her entire life, that some people would always see her as less. No matter her age, no matter her dignity. The second officer stepped closer now. So close that she could smell the faint odor of coffee on his breath. "Ma'am, we need you to be honest with us," he said, his words sharp. "What are you really doing out here?" The woman blinked, her eyebrows furrowing. "I told you," she replied, her voice still calm but firmer now. "I went to the store. I'm going home." She lifted her grocery bag slightly, letting the items inside rustle. A loaf of bread peeked through the top. "These are groceries." That's all. But they weren't interested in bread or truth. They were interested in control. "Ma'am," the first officer interrupted, his hand resting on his belt near his radio. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this neighborhood. You fit the description." The woman almost laughed, not out of humor, but out of disbelief. "Suspicious activity?" she asked, raising her eyebrow. "What description could possibly fit me? An old woman carrying bread?" The crowd behind them stirred, murmuring in agreement. The officers glanced back nervously, but didn't back down. The second officer pulled out a small notepad, flipping it open dramatically as if taking down a criminal's confession. "What's your full name again?" He asked, scribbling quickly without even looking at her ID anymore. "And your date of birth?" The woman gave him the information without hesitation, but her patience was wearing thin. She could feel the insult growing heavier with every unnecessary question. Every word they spoke was not about justice, it was about humiliation. "Where were you before the store?" the first officer asked suddenly. "At home," she answered. "Who were you with?" "No one." "Why were you walking and not driving?" "Because I don't drive anymore. My legs still work fine." Each question was sharper than the last, designed not to gather facts but to poke holes in her life. She could see the officers exchanging glances, silently daring each other to push further. Her hands trembled slightly, not with fear, but with the frustration of a woman who had lived through decades of this same tired game. She had seen it. In her youth, when laws were written to silence voices like hers. She had seen it as a mother, when her children were questioned simply for walking home after school. And now, even in her old age, she was living it again. She looked around at the growing crowd. She saw young faces filled with anger, older faces filled with weariness, and she realized something. This wasn't just about her. This was about every person who had ever been treated as less. This was about every grandmother, every grandfather, every child who had been made to feel like a stranger in their own neighborhood. The second officer took a step closer, his voice low and threatening now. "You know, ma'am, we could take you down to the station if we're not satisfied with your answers." That was the final straw. The woman straightened her back, her eyes narrowing. She was tired, yes, but not powerless. They didn't know who she was. They didn't know who her family was. And they certainly didn't know that the very law they claimed to represent ran through the veins of her son, the man who had dedicated his life to justice. She reached into her purse, her fingers brushing against her phone. The officers noticed and scoffed, one muttering, "Who you gonna call? Your neighbor?" But they would soon find out the truth. The harassment had gone far enough. The line had been crossed. And with a single phone call, the balance of power in that moment was about to shift completely. The elderly woman stood firm on the cracked pavement, the grocery bag still resting against her leg. The police officers continued circling her like vultures, their questions sharp, their tone mocking. But something in her presence began to change. She was no longer just a woman being hassled on the street. She was a symbol of dignity refusing to be broken. Her back straightened, and her eyes, though softened with age, shone with a quiet fire. She had been on this earth too long to let two strangers in uniform rob her of her humanity. She had endured storms far greater than this. She had lived through decades of change, some for better, some for worse, but through it all, she had learned one truth. No one could take away her dignity unless she allowed them to. "Ma'am," the first officer said again, his voice louder, now as if volume could make up for the weakness of his authority. "Answer the question. Why are you really out here?" She tilted her head slightly, her lips curling into the faintest smile. "I already told you," she said gently. "I went to the store. I bought bread, and now I'm going home." Her calmness unsettled them. They expected fear. They expected tears or trembling knees. Instead, she gave them poise, the kind that comes not from arrogance but from the wisdom of years. The second officer shifted uncomfortably, tapping his notepad against his palm. "Don't get smart with us," he snapped. "We're just doing our job." "Your job," she replied softly, "is to protect and serve, not to harass and belittle." Her words struck like stones thrown into a pond, sending ripples across the gathering crowd. Someone in the back let out a quiet cheer. A young woman recording whispered, "That's right," under her breath. The elderly woman hadn't raised her voice, yet her words carried more weight than the shouts of the officers. For a moment, the officers hesitated. They weren't used to being challenged, especially not by someone they had dismissed so easily in their minds. She was supposed to be weak. She was supposed to be compliant. But instead, she stood tall, her dignity acting like armor, no badge. Could pierce dot inside her mind. Memories began to flicker like old film reels. She remembered being a young girl, standing at the back of a bus, told she could not sit in the front. She remembered the first time she was denied entry into a store, not because she had no money, but because of the color of her skin. She remembered holding her children's hands, whispering to them to be careful around the police, to always say yes sir and no sir, because she knew the risks of being seen as defiant. But now, as an old woman, she realized she had nothing left to prove and nothing left to fear. If not now, then when? If not her, then who? The officers tried again to press her, their questions stumbling over one another. Do you live alone? Do you have witnesses? Are you hiding something? Each question dripped with accusation, but each answer she gave was calm, patient, and unwavering. No, I am not hiding anything. Yes, I have lived here many years. Yes, I know my neighbors. No, I will not let you speak to me like I am less than human. Her voice was steady, her tone respectful but firm. She never shouted, never cursed, never lost her composure. That was her power. The more they tried to strip away her dignity, the more she showed them she would not let it go. The crowd grew larger. More phones were raised, more whispers of support passed through the air. Some people muttered angrily at the officers, but the elderly woman did not join in. She was not here to humiliate anyone. She was here to remind them what respect looked like, even in the face of disrespect. The first officer's jaw tightened. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. Lady, you're making this harder on yourself. Cooperate, or things are gonna get ugly. She met his stare with calm eyes. Things only get ugly when people forget their humanity, she replied. I haven't forgotten mine, have you? Her words silenced him for a second. He blinked, as if unsure how to respond. No one had ever spoken to him like that, without fear, without anger, only with truth. The woman adjusted the strap of her purse on her shoulder. Though her body was frail, her spirit radiated strength. In that moment, she was not simply an elderly woman facing two police officers. She was every mother who had stood up for her child. Every grandmother who had endured cruelty with grace. Every person who had refused to bow under the weight of injustice. She could feel the power shifting slowly. The officers were still in control physically. They had badges, radios, authority, but she held something greater, moral authority. And moral authority, when held with dignity, is unshakable. The younger people in the crowd looked at her with admiration. Some whispered, "She's brave." Others said, "She reminds me of my grandma." They saw in her a lesson that could not be taught in schools or written in textbooks. They saw the strength of dignity in action. The officers tried one last time to assert their dominance. "Ma'am, we need you to stop resisting and answer our questions." She smiled gently, tilting her head. "Resisting?" She asked. "I am standing here. I am answering you. I am not shouting. I am not fighting. The only thing I refuse to do is surrender my dignity. If you call that resisting, then maybe you are the ones who need to answer some questions." The words hit like thunder. The crowd erupted in murmurs of agreement. The officers' faces flushed with frustration, but their voices faltered. The woman did not know yet what was about to happen next. She did not know that soon, with one phone call, the entire situation would flip upside down. But in that moment, she didn't need to know. What mattered was that she had shown them, and everyone watching, that dignity cannot be taken by force. And so she stood there, a quiet storm in human form, steady, graceful, and unshaken. The air was thick with tension. Every second felt longer than the last, as if the world itself had paused to watch the scene unfold. The elderly woman stood on the cracked sidewalk, clutching her grocery bag, her dignity shining like a shield. The officers still circled her, their voices sharper, their threats heavier. But despite their effort, they could not break her spirit. Yet even the strongest spirit must sometimes decide. Enough is enough. The crowd that had gathered watched closely. Some held up their phones, recording every second, every word, every glance. Others whispered angrily, asking why two grown men with badges and weapons were harassing someone who looked old enough to be their grandmother. But the officers ignored the crowd. Their eyes were locked on her, determined to force her into submission. The younger officer leaned in, his face just inches from hers. "Lady," he said in a low, threatening tone, "if you don't start cooperating the way we want, we'll take you down to the station. Do you understand me?" The woman looked at him calmly. Her heart was beating faster now, but not out of fear. It was out of resolve. She had already answered every question with honesty. She had stood her ground with grace. But if they thought they could continue to humiliate her, they were about to learn just how mistaken they were. She reached slowly into her purse. The officers tensed immediately, one of them instinctively moving his hand closer to his holster. "What are you doing?" he barked. "Keep your hands where I can see them." The woman ignored the rising panic in their voices. Her movements were steady, deliberate. She wasn't rushing, wasn't trembling. She pulled out her phone, the small device gleaming under the afternoon sun. The officers exchanged quick glances. Then, almost at the same time, they smirked. The older one scoffed. "What, you gonna call a friend? Maybe your neighbor? Go ahead. Won't change a thing." The younger officer laughed, shaking his head. "Yeah, maybe she'll call her knitting club," he muttered under his breath, earning a chuckle from his partner. Their laughter carried through the crowd. Some bystanders frowned. Others whispered angrily, "That's not funny. Leave her alone." The woman heard the mocking tone, but she did not let it shake her. Instead, she pressed the screen of her phone with practiced ease. Her hands may have been aged, her fingers lined with years of work and life, but in that moment, they were steady as stone. She scrolled through her contacts and pressed one number. Just one. The officers crossed their arms, waiting. "Who you calling, Grandma?" one of them teased. "Your son? You think he's gonna come running out of that little house down the street?" The woman lifted her chin slightly, her eyes meeting. "Yes," she said calmly. "I am calling my son." The first officer rolled his eyes. "Good. We'll have a nice little chat with him too." The phone rang once, twice, then connected. "Hello?" came the voice on the other. And strong, steady, unmistakably authoritative. "Son," the woman said softly, her voice steady though everyone around her leaned in to hear. "I'm standing on the street near the store. 2 police officers have stopped me. They are harassing me for no reason. I thought you should know." The crowd went silent. The officers froze. Something in her tone, something in her words made their smug expressions falter. "Who is your son?" the younger officer asked, his voice suddenly less certain. The woman looked at him calmly, her phone still pressed to her ear. "My son," she said, her voice carrying like thunder in the quiet street, "is the U.S. Attorney General." The words hit like a bombshell. The officers blinked, their smugness instantly draining from their faces. One of them coughed nervously, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. The younger one's jaw tightened, his eyes darting from the woman to the crowd, then back to the phone in her hand. On the other end of the line, the son's voice grew firm. "Put one of those officers on the phone," he commanded. The woman held the phone out toward them. For a moment, neither officer moved. They stared at the device as though it were something dangerous, something that could unravel their careers in an instant. The older officer finally cleared his throat, forcing a weak smile. "Now, ma'am, there's no need to get your family involved. We were just checking. Take the phone." she interrupted firmly. Her tone was no longer gentle. It carried the authority of a mother who had endured enough. The officer hesitated, then reluctantly reached for the phone. He pressed it to his ear. "Yes, sir," he said quickly, his posture suddenly stiff. His voice, once filled with arrogance, now carried nervous respect. "Yes, sir, we were just—" "No, sir, it wasn't like that." His words stumbled over themselves, his excuses falling apart in real time. The crowd watched in awe. The same officer who had mocked her minutes earlier was now stammering like a schoolboy caught in a lie. The elderly woman stood silently, her dignity unshaken. She didn't need to raise her voice or argue anymore. The truth had revealed itself. The balance of power had shifted completely, not because she shouted, not because she fought, but because she knew who she was and she knew her worth. The second officer tried to avoid her gaze, his face flushed red. He muttered something under his breath, but the crowd could see his unease. They could see the moment the officers realized they had picked the wrong person, the wrong grandmother, the wrong human being to try and intimidate. The turning point had come. The officers who once thought they held all the power now stood exposed, embarrassed, and afraid. The woman had made one phone call, and the weight of justice itself now hung over them. And as the first officer handed the phone back to her, his hands trembling slightly, she looked him straight in the eye and said softly, "Respect should not depend on who I am related to. It should depend on the fact that I am a human being." The crowd erupted in cheers that the turning point had arrived, not just for her, but for everyone watching. The phone felt heavy in the officer's hand, as if the weight of his entire career suddenly balanced on that small device. His smug expression had vanished, replaced by beads of sweat forming at his temple. The crowd leaned closer, their phones recording, their whispers sharp with curiosity. This was no longer just an encounter on a quiet street, it was becoming a scene that would echo far beyond this neighborhood. On the other end of the line, the voice of the U.S. Attorney General cut through the static, calm but commanding. "Officer," he said slowly, "this is my mother you have stopped. Explain to me clearly why she is being detained." The officer swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "Sir, with all due respect," he stammered, we weren't detaining her. We were just conducting a routine check, standard protocol." "Standard protocol?" The Attorney General's voice interrupted, sharp as a blade. "Your standard protocol is to hassle an elderly woman carrying groceries, to demand she prove where she lives in her own neighborhood, to threaten to arrest her without cause." The officer's face turned red. He opened his mouth, but words failed him. Every excuse he had rehearsed in his head sounded hollow. He glanced at his partner, silently begging for help, but the second officer quickly looked away, pretending to be busy adjusting his notepad. The woman stood calmly, watching. Her eyes were steady, her posture unshaken. For years she had carried herself with dignity, and now, in front of the very men who tried to strip it from her, she wore it like a crown. The Attorney General's voice grew firmer. "Put my mother back on the line." The officer quickly handed the phone to her, his hands trembling slightly. She accepted it with grace, pressing it to her ear. "Yes, son," she said softly, her voice calm but carrying for everyone to hear. "Are you all right, Mama?" The Attorney General asked, his voice gentler now. "Yes, I am all right," she replied. "They tried to frighten me, but you know me. I do not scare easily." The crowd chuckled softly at her words. Even in the middle of harassment, she carried herself with unshakable pride. "Listen carefully," the Attorney General said. His voice lowered, but the firmness in his tone remained. "Stay where you are. I will have this handled immediately. You should not have to go through this ever." She smiled faintly, her eyes never leaving the officers. "I know, son, but sometimes lessons must be taught. Not for me, but for them." The officers shifted uncomfortably, their earlier bravado completely gone. The second officer, who had been scribbling in his notepad as if he were preparing a case against her, now closed it quietly, sliding it back into his pocket. His eyes avoided hers, fixed instead on the ground. But the crowd had not missed a thing. They saw the fear in the officers' faces, the power slipping from their hands, the truth being revealed. Phones tilted higher, capturing every second. Some whispered excitedly, "That's her son? The Attorney General?" Others gasped, shaking their heads. The Attorney General's voice returned, louder now, demanding, "Officers, I expect a full explanation filed immediately with your superiors. My office will be contacting your department tonight. You will be held accountable for every second of this unnecessary harassment." The first officer nodded instinctively, forgetting the Attorney General couldn't see him. Yes, sir. Understood, sir. It won't happen again." His words sounded small, like a child caught in the middle of wrongdoing. The second officer finally found his voice, muttering quickly, "Sir, it was just a misunderstanding, that's all. We didn't mean any harm." The Attorney General's voice turned icy. "A misunderstanding? You thought it was acceptable to intimidate an elderly woman walking home? Do you understand how easily this could have ended differently? Do you realize the danger you put her in? Or do you only realize it now because you discovered who she is?" Silence. Neither officer dared to respond. The woman, still holding the phone, lifted her head high. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "You see?" she said, addressing the officers directly now. "It shouldn't take knowing who my son is for you to treat me with respect. It should come naturally, because I am a human being. Every person you meet deserves that same respect." Her words rang louder than any command, louder than any threat of disciplinary action. The crowd clapped softly, some nodding, others wiping away tears. They knew this moment wasn't just about her. It was about all of them. She handed the phone back to the officer once more. "He wants to speak with you again," she said simply. The officer, his hands clammy, pressed the phone to his ear. "Yes, sir. Yes, I understand. We'll escort her home immediately. Yes, we'll file the report." "Yes, sir. Understood." When the call ended, the officer handed the phone back to her, his shoulders slumped. His tone, once arrogant, was now almost apologetic. "Ma'am," he said, forcing a weak smile, "it seems there's been some miscommunication. We just wanted to make sure you were safe, that's all." The woman raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Safe?" she asked. "You don't make people feel safe by harassing them. You make them feel safe by treating them with kindness, with fairness, and with dignity." Her words cut through him like glass. He had no answer. The second officer muttered quickly, "We'll walk you home, ma'am, just to be sure." But the crowd wasn't convinced. They laughed, some booed softly, others shouted, "Too late for that." The officers kept their heads low, embarrassed, their authority crumbling under the weight of truth. The elderly woman, however, didn't gloat. She didn't rub their shame in their faces. Instead, she nodded slowly, her eyes calm. "If you wish to walk me home," she said, "you may. But remember this, you walk beside me as equals, not as masters. That is the only way respect is real." The crowd cheered louder now, their voices filling the street. And as the officers reluctantly followed her, their pride broken. The people watching knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. The moment when power shifted, not because of force, but because of truth, courage, and one phone call that changed everything. The street had grown unusually quiet, as though every sound, the chirping birds, the humming engines, even the children's laughter from down the block, had paused to bear witness. The elderly woman stood with her chin lifted, calm and unwavering. Beside her, two officers shifted uncomfortably, their once puffed chests now slouched. Their once sharp voices now muted by the weight of realization that it was the kind of silence that carries power, the kind where everyone in the crowd knew something had shifted forever. The younger officer swallowed hard, his throat dry. His partner glanced at him, but neither spoke. For years they had been used to encounters like this, stopping people who looked out of place, demanding answers, making their presence known through intimidation rather than respect. Most people bowed their heads, answered quickly, and walked away humiliated. But this time was different. This time, they had chosen the wrong person, at the wrong moment, in the wrong way. The phone call had exposed them. The words, U.S. Attorney General, still rang in their ears like a siren. They couldn't silence. They hadn't just hassled any ordinary woman. They had harassed the mother of one of the most powerful legal figures in the nation. And worse still, they had done it in full view of dozens of witnesses, every second captured by cameras and phones. Realization spread across their faces, draining the last bit of arrogance from their eyes. The younger officer muttered under his breath, almost to himself, "We're finished." The older one tried to maintain composure, but his trembling hands betrayed him. He looked at the woman and forced a weak smile, the kind born not from kindness, but desperation. "Ma'am," he stammered, "please understand. This wasn't personal. We just weren't personal." She interrupted gently, her voice calm but piercing. "Every word you spoke to me was personal. Every threat you made was personal. You saw me, an old woman, and decided I didn't belong. Tell me, what part of that is not personal?" The crowd hummed in agreement, their whispers turning into louder mutters. Phones tilted higher. The tension in the air pressed down on the officers like a weight they could no longer carry. The younger one ran a nervous hand over his short hair, his face pale. "Look, we didn't know who you were," he blurted out. The woman's eyes softened, but her reply was sharp. "And that is the problem," she said. "You should not need to know who I am to treat me with dignity. It should not take my son's title for you to see my worth." The crowd erupted in applause. Some clapped, some whistled, others shouted, "That's right." The energy of the community surged, their voices rising in support of the woman who had just spoken truth into the heart of injustice. The officers flinched at the noise. They weren't used to being the ones on the defensive. Their authority, once unquestioned, now felt like a fragile mask that had cracked beyond repair. The older officer attempted to regain some ground. "Ma'am, let's not blow this out of proportion. Out of proportion?" She cut in again, her tone sharper this time. "Do you know what it feels like to be stopped for no reason? To be treated like a criminal when all you've done is buy bread? Do you know the humiliation of being questioned in front of your own neighbors, as if you don't belong in the very community you helped build?" The officer's mouth opened, then closed. He had no answer. The woman's voice lowered, steady and strong. "This is not about proportion. This is about respect. Something you both forgot the moment you stopped me." The officers looked down at the ground, their shame growing heavier by the second. The younger one kicked at a pebble on the pavement, his mind racing with the consequences. He could already imagine the reports, the disciplinary hearings, the conversations with supervisors. His career, once filled with certainty, now felt like sand slipping through his fingers. The crowd, sensing the shift, began speaking louder. "They picked the wrong woman," someone shouted. "Justice is coming now," cried another. The atmosphere had turned electric, charged with the collective realization that power no longer sat solely in the officer's hands. The woman turned her gaze to the people watching, her voice rising so all could hear. "Remember this," she said, pointing gently toward the officers. "They thought they had power because of a badge. But real power does not come from intimidation. Real power comes from truth, from dignity, from standing tall even when others try to push you down." Her words rolled across the crowd like a wave. People nodded, tears glistened in some eyes, and the phones kept recording, eager to share her wisdom far beyond the block. The officers finally spoke again, their voices shaking. "We were sorry," the younger one whispered. It was barely audible, but it carried. The apology wasn't strong, wasn't enough, but it was there. The weight of their mistake had forced it out. The woman looked at them, her expression unreadable. She didn't gloat, didn't smile in triumph. She simply said, "Sorry is a start. But change is what matters." The older officer's eyes darted toward the crowd. He could see faces etched with anger, disappointment, and disgust. He could hear the whispers about accountability, about consequences, about justice. And in that moment, he realized this incident would follow him forever. The woman took a deep breath, her chest rising slowly. She turned back to the officers one final time. "This could have been simple," she said softly. "A greeting, a kind word, maybe even an offer to carry my bag. But instead, you chose suspicion, hostility, and threats. And now, instead of walking away with respect, you will walk away with shame." The crowd cheered, louder than before. Some clapped, others shouted her name, though many didn't even know it yet. To them, she wasn't just a woman with groceries, she was a warrior wrapped in wisdom, a grandmother who had taught a lesson without raising her hand or her voice. The officers, overwhelmed, looked at each other. Their eyes carried the same unspoken thought. They had not just harassed a woman, they had humiliated themselves. The realization hit them like a tidal wave. They weren't the ones in control anymore. The truth had flipped the story, and now, they were the ones being judged. The woman adjusted her purse strap, lifted her grocery bag, and stood tall. Her face was calm, serene, almost motherly. "Respect should never be optional," she said finally. "It should be automatic. Let this be the last time you forget that." The crowd erupted in applause once more, the sound echoing down the block. The officers stood frozen, unable to escape the truth of their actions. The shock had taken root, and the realization was carved into their faces forever. And in that moment, under the bright afternoon sun, everyone knew the lesson would live on, not just in the hearts of those who witnessed it, but in the memory of those who caused it. The tension on the street had reached its peak. The officers had gone from confident enforcers to silent, shamed men standing in front of a grandmother who had just dismantled their arrogance with nothing more than dignity and truth. The phone call had changed everything. The crowd's voices had grown stronger, their phones raised higher, and the balance of power was no longer in the hands of the officers. And then it happened, the shift. The officers' faces, once hard and stern, softened with forced smiles. Their voices, once sharp with command, now dripped with politeness. Their stances, once puffed up with authority, now bent slightly, as if humbled by the weight of what had just transpired. "Ma'am," the older officer began, his voice carrying a tone that sounded rehearsed but desperate. "We'd like to, escort you home, just to make sure you get there safely." The crowd exploded in laughter. The irony was too much. Moments ago, these same men had threatened to arrest her, questioned her like a criminal, and now they wanted to play the role of protectors. Safe from what? A young man shouted from the crowd, "Safe from you?" More laughter rippled through the people gathered, but the woman herself remained calm. She looked at the officers with eyes that were neither cruel nor forgiving, but deeply knowing. "Safety," she said softly, "is not something you give me with your presence. Safety is something you take away when you misuse your power." The older officer's cheeks flushed. His forced smile twitched at the corners. He nodded quickly, muttering, "Yes, ma'am." "Understood, ma'am." The younger officer, still pale, stepped forward nervously. His voice cracked as he spoke. We're sorry for the misunderstanding, ma'am. It won't happen again. Please allow us to walk with you. It's the least we can do." The woman raised an eyebrow. The least they could do? The least they could do was not harass her in the first place. But she said nothing for a moment, letting the silence fill the air. The crowd leaned in, waiting for her response, their eyes flicking between the trembling officers and the woman, who held the entire street in her calm hands. Finally she spoke. "If you wish to walk beside me, then you may. But you will not walk ahead of me, as if I am your prisoner. And you will not walk behind me, as if you are stalking me. You will walk beside me, as equals. Do you understand?" The officers exchanged quick glances, then nodded in unison. "Yes, ma'am," they muttered, their voices subdued. The crowd erupted into cheers and clapping. "That's right," someone shouted. "Beside her, not above her." The woman adjusted her grocery bag, then took her first step down the sidewalk. The officers followed immediately, one on her left and one on her right, their heads slightly bowed. The crowd trailed behind, recording, laughing, cheering, shouting words of encouragement. The scene looked almost surreal. 2 armed officers, flanking an elderly woman like nervous schoolboys forced to walk in line with their teacher. As they walked, the younger officer tried again to save face. "Ma'am," he said awkwardly, we just wanted to make sure the neighborhood was safe, that's all." The woman didn't even look at him. Her voice remained calm, but her words sliced through his excuse. "Safety does not come from suspicion. Safety comes from trust. And trust is something you both have lost today." The older officer winced. He tried to change the subject. "Your son, he's very important. You must be very proud." The woman stopped walking. Slowly, she turned her head and looked him straight in the eye. "I am proud of my son," she said firmly. "But understand this, my worth is not defined by his title. I deserve respect not because I am the mother of the Attorney General. I deserve respect because I am a person. And so does every single person you stop on the street, no matter who their children are." The crowd roared in applause again. Phones zoomed in closer. Someone shouted, "Tell them, Grandma." Another voice cried, "That's history right there." The officers lowered their heads, their pride stripped away completely. Each step they took beside her now felt like a walk of shame, every eye in the crowd watching, every camera recording their humiliation. As they reached the corner where her small brick house stood, the woman paused. She looked at her home, then back at the officers. For a long moment, she said nothing. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable for the men beside her. Finally, she spoke. "You see this house?" she asked quietly. The younger officer nodded quickly. "Yes, ma'am." "This is where I raised my children," she continued. "This is where I taught them values, taught them right from wrong, taught them to respect others no matter who they were. And now my son has become one of the most powerful voices for justice in this country. Do you know why? Because he learned from me. From a woman you thought didn't belong here." Asterisk, the officers looked at the house, then at her, shame carved into their faces. The woman's voice grew stronger, carrying over the crowd. "What you forgot today is that every person you stop, every person you look down on, has a story. They have a family. They have dignity, you forgot that. And now, you will remember it forever." The cheers from the crowd grew deafening. People clapped, whistled, even chanted her name, though many didn't even know it. They didn't need to. She had become more than a name. She had become a symbol. The officers nodded silently, their shoulders slumped, their voices gone. They stood there like statues, stripped of their arrogance, their authority reduced to nothing more than fabric and metal, pinned to their chests. The woman took her final step toward her door. She turned to the crowd and smiled faintly. "Thank you for standing with me," she said. "Remember, dignity is not a gift others can give you. It is yours, and no one can take it away unless you let them." The crowd cheered again, their voices echoing down the block. And with that, she opened her door, stepped inside, and closed it gently behind her. The 2 officers remained frozen on the sidewalk, their faces pale, their hands twitching. The immediate change in their behavior had been obvious, but so had the humiliation. They had tried to shift from aggressors to protectors, but the crowd, and the woman herself, had seen the truth. Respect born out of fear is not real respect. And, in that moment, as they stood there surrounded by laughter and jeers, they realized the truth of what had just happened. They hadn't escorted a woman home. They had escorted themselves into history, a lesson in humility, dignity, and justice that the world would not soon forget. Asterisk. The door closed softly behind her, the quiet click echoing like the final note of a song. Inside her small brick house, the elderly woman set her grocery bag down on the kitchen counter. The loaf of bread, the small carton of milk, the fresh apples, ordinary items from an ordinary trip, had somehow become part of an extraordinary story. She exhaled, long and slow, her hands resting on the counter. She was calm now, but the truth of what had just happened lingered in the air like a storm that had only just passed. Outside, the street was still buzzing. Neighbors gathered in clusters, replaying every word, every moment. Children tugged on their parents' sleeves, asking what had happened. Young people checked their phones, uploading videos that were already beginning to spread. The officers, once towering figures of authority, stood awkwardly by the sidewalk, their presence no longer commanding but apologetic, even pitiful. Immediate tension had passed, but something far more powerful remained. A lesson. For the officers, the lesson was sharp and unforgettable. They had walked into the encounter with arrogance, assuming their uniforms gave them the right to demand, intimidate, and belittle. But they had walked away humbled, their authority shaken not by violence, not by force, but by the calm defiance of a grandmother who refused to bow her head. They had learned painfully that respect cannot be demanded through fear. It must be earned through humanity. The younger officer replayed the moment in his mind when she had said, "Respect should never be optional. It should be automatic." Those words gnawed at him. He had heard plenty of complaints before in his career, plenty of people shouting about injustice. But none of it had struck him the way her voice had, steady and unshaken. For the first time, he felt truly ashamed, not because of the consequences he might face, but because he realized how far he had strayed from the oath he once swore. The older officer fared no better. He had been on the force longer, carried himself with hardened pride. But standing beside her house, listening to the cheers of the crowd, he felt smaller than he ever had in his life. For years he had convinced himself that intimidation was a tool of the job, but now he saw how wrong he was. The badge on his chest was supposed to symbolize protection, not power. And today, in front of everyone, he had betrayed that symbol. The crowd, too, carried the lesson home with them. Many had recorded the incident, and within hours, the videos spread across social media. But more importantly, they carried the memory of what they had witnessed. They had seen injustice with their own eyes, but they had also seen how it could be dismantled, not with anger, not with violence, but with dignity and truth. Parents would tell their children about it. Young people would remember the strength of the elderly woman and carry that lesson forward into their own lives. For the woman herself, the lesson was not new. She had lived through too much to be surprised by the way she had been treated. She knew the world could be unkind, could be cruel, could be unjust. But what mattered to her was not the cruelty, it was how one responded to it. And on that street, under the hot afternoon sun, she had chosen to respond with dignity, patience, and truth. That was the legacy she wanted to leave behind. Later that evening, she sat quietly by her window, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her. It was her son, the Attorney General. "Mama," he said, his voice softer now, the urgency gone. "Are you all right?" "Yes, son," she replied calmly. "I am fine. I'm sorry you had to go." "Through that," he said, "it never should have happened." She smiled faintly. "No, it should not have. But sometimes the world needs reminders. Today was one of those reminders. Her son sighed. I've already spoken with their department. There will be consequences. She shook her head gently, though he could not see it. Consequences are necessary, yes. But remember, son, real change does not come only from punishment. Real change comes from learning. If they have learned something today, then perhaps it was worth it. There was silence on the line. Then her son spoke again, his voice filled with admiration. You've always been stronger than me, Mama. The woman chuckled softly. Not stronger, just older. Life teaches lessons if you live long enough. As the conversation ended, she leaned back in her chair, her eyes closing for a moment. She thought of the crowd outside, of the voices cheering, of the faces filled with awe and respect. She thought of the officers, standing pale and silent, their arrogance shattered. And she thought of the generations to come, who might hear the story and learn that dignity is more powerful than intimidation. The lesson of that day spread far beyond her street. News outlets picked it up, social media buzzed with clips, and people everywhere discussed what had happened. Some called her a hero. Others said she had exposed a truth many already knew, but few had seen so clearly. But to her, she was not a hero. She was simply a woman who refused to let anyone take away her humanity. The officers would never forget it. The crowd would never forget it. And she knew her son, despite his high position, would carry it with him as well, a reminder that justice is not just about laws or courts, but about everyday encounters between ordinary people. The true lesson was simple, yet powerful. Respect must never depend on titles, appearances, or assumptions. It must be given freely, automatically, to every human being. And so that quiet street became more than just a block of houses. It became a stage for truth, a reminder carved into memory. Long after the crowd had dispersed, long after the officers had walked away in shame, long after the sun had set, the lesson remained alive, unshaken, eternal.